know. But for those of you who do not know Wendy, let me just read a small paragraph here from the book about the author. Wendy Ostroff's expertise in cognitive psychology, forgive me my accent, I'm from somewhere else, but nevertheless. Cognitive psychology, child development, and the metacognition stems from her research experience as a scientist in the Infant Perception Laboratory at Virginia Tech, as a visiting scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, and as a Carnegie Scholar with Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching at Stanford University. She has been developing curriculum on children's learning for the past 15 years in the Hutchins School of Liberal Studies at Sonoma State University, in the Department of Education and Child Study at Smith College, and most recently as Associate Professor in the Program for Advancement of Learning at Curry College. Dr. Ostroff has taught more than 30 distinct university-level courses and has been granted 3 University Excellence in Teaching Awards. She is deeply committed to design and implementation of state-of-the-art education. When I was reading all this, even though my English is not good, I remember each one of those instances. Carnegie program, Germany, and on that trip, she made a mistake of not obeying me. She went all the way to Scandinavia and got sick over there, almost died. And when she came back to Belgium, she got healthy. Yeah. But anyway, all this simply to say she's a dear friend. I did read Wendy's book, and I would like to say that when I started, because of the scientific nature of the book, I was biased because science is so misunderstood in the political scheme of things here, and people use science often in the wrong way. The authority of science is exaggerated. But I was surprised that the book did actually have many of my own biases. And I love that. And, I would recommend to anybody who is a teacher this book, anybody who's a lawyer this book. To some extent, lawyering is educating the people and educating the jury. Yeah. Any activist should read this book, because this is the book that tells you that you should not despair over American people. Everybody can learn it. But anyway, thank you for coming, and let's just give a little bit of hands to our friend.
Come on in, there's some room. I guess, do we have standing room only? Do we have benches? I don't know.
There's room.
Welcome.
Grab a couple benches.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, we have
Okay. Wow, a lot of old friends and so many people. Thank you so much, Matumbo, for the wonderful introduction. So, yeah, I guess we can be sort of casual, even though this seems like a very formal event suddenly. But it's very nice to be here. It's always been a dream of mine to give a book reading at Modern Times. So here we are. Here we are. So as Matumbo mentioned, the beginning of my career was spent in the lab working with infants, working on cognitive science and child development, infant speech perception at Virginia Tech, at Max Planck Institute, and then a decade of training pre-service teachers about learning and how to approach the classroom. So there's all this experience is coming together, and there's also a big influence of growing up in a working class family in New England. So let me put those pieces together. The part of it is seeing all these interesting findings coming out of the lab, the latest research on how infants and children learn, how learning happens, what happens in the brain, and then seeing teachers so excited to go out into the world and realizing that there's a huge disconnect between all this knowledge funneling through. And I would go to these international conferences every year of child development and see scholars from all over the world with hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant money and finding the nuances of learning and realizing that those findings were staying in these little peer-reviewed journals and locked away and not ever making their way into on the ground with children who are actually learning and teachers who are actually struggling to get them there. So that's the practical side of me that says, hey, hold on, we can't be wasting all this effort and energy. We need to take these findings and bring them together. And I had wondered, why hasn't anyone done this before, until I got so mired in the research, and then I figured out that's why no one's done this before, because there's a mountain of research on cognitive development, and it's almost a different language. I remember being a graduate student and wanting to take a course in the human development department, which was a very applied department, and I was in developmental psychology, and I wasn't even allowed to take a course in the department with the people who are working with the children. We were only, in the lab. I had to get special permission to even talk to them. And the lingo is different, the methods were different. So my goal in writing this book, and it was a long process, was to bring together those groups of folks who don't necessarily have access to each other's findings. And as Matumbo mentioned, there's a political background to this, and that has to do with the concept of access and making things available to the people who can benefit from those things. And there's also a cultural issue here, because why aren't those things done? Why is the culture of academia so kept in the ivory tower, and why is it not shared as it should be? So there's a few questions that kind of drove this, and that's first looking at the history of the education system in the U.S., which is really an industrial model. Came out of public education is, from the Industrial Revolution to educate the worker, the next round of workers, something to do with those kids when we couldn't keep them in the factories anymore, and get them ready to be able to understand directions and get them ready to obey and to function in the way that the people in charge want them to function. So a lot of those things of that industrial model of education are still in place. Things like lining children up in rows, to look at the person up on the stage, or up in the front of the class, that imparts the idea that the goal of the teacher is to give knowledge to people who don't have knowledge. The idea that you should be learning with people that are born the same year you're born. The idea that we should be in competition with each other and should be tested and performance measures. A lot of those things are not based on how learning happens. We start to look at what we know about learning, and there's been a huge explosion in the last 20 years, and especially in the last 10 years, of cognitive science understanding of learning. And you start to see that a lot of the ways things have been done is really based on tradition alone and not based on what we know about learning. So that's my real first driving question, is why the mismatch between the education system and the way things happen. And we can imagine some answers to that about control and such. But so the way I started to look at this is to look at things that kind of move learning forward, just to deal with this mountain of information. And I came up with this concept of propellers of learning, so things that kind of push learning ahead. So I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the findings that I think are most exciting or most interesting or most unique, and some of the ways that I've taken a stab at ways that they could be applied, unique ways. The first propeller of learning is novelty. And you see novelty preference right from birth. New babies prefer novel stimulation to familiar stimulation. Actually, even in utero, you can have a fetus play the same acoustic stimulation over and over, and they'll habituate, and they'll essentially get bored with that, and then be a heightened response to something that's new or novel. So novelty, children, and probably all of us, are really driven by what's exciting, what's new, and children have this unquenchable urge for exploration. Pavlov called it the exploratory reflex, and this concept that you can't get enough of checking things out. And there's just been so many studies over the years on that, where you bring children in, and what they'll do is they'll explore naturally the characteristics of something that they're supposed to learn. So a box with lights and things to look in. I mean, you can't stop someone that's age 1 through 9 or 10 from checking it out, from going in there and checking it out. In fact, most of what we're trying to do is get kids to stop checking it out and stop exploring in school, when really exploring is so important for learning. And that leads to sort of a principle of developmental science that's kind of a theme through my book, which is that a lot of learning happens without conscious effort. And a lot of philosophers and writers have talked about this concept that throughout our human history, we've learned what we need to learn just by living, just by being part of it. And we learn nonstop. I mean, this idea that we learn and we stop learning, and we learn in school and we don't learn outside of school, that's just not true. I mean, even the children that you say, I can't get through to them, they're not learning, they're learning lots. They just may not be learning what we want them to be learning, but we're constantly learning, and especially children. So novelty is a big part of that, and that kind of zest and unquenchable thirst for learning, it kind of goes hand in hand with another learning propeller, which is confidence. So confidence, as you know, is a huge part of being motivated, and a huge part of being present enough to take in a situation. Well, there's this class